the government cut taxes before the next election? And do we need more workers from the EU? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, Labour peer Jenny Chapman, General Secretary of Unison Christina McAnee, and the editor of City AM Andy Sylvester. Today, all smiles as President Biden arrives in Britain for talks with the Prime Minister. It's the fifth time the men have met in 5 months, but with a growing list of policy disagreements, could it be an awkward get-together? Also today, are tax cuts before the next election now off the table?
As soon as we can, we will cut taxes, but we do have to be fiscally responsible about this.
This Brexiteer former cabinet minister says we need more EU workers to fill job vacancies here in Britain. Is he right? And no apparent end in sight to ongoing strikes, but are they working? Well, let's start with the story that the American president, Joe Biden, is in Britain. We can show you pictures of Downing Street. We're expecting him to arrive in number 10 very shortly. The world's press are all gathered, just out of shot for the moment, but you'll see all the cameras and all the journalists. And we're going to talk to one of the most prominent journalists, a member of the press, gathered there, the BBC's chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. A significant moment, Nick.
Hi, Joe. Morning to you. It absolutely is. You know, when a president walks up this street and does the handshake, it's always a big moment. Interestingly, the photo of the day might not be here. It may well be the president when he meets the king later. But, you know, it's all about soft power. It's all about the US trying to show that that relationship with the UK still really matters. I think the big question today is whether there's much of substance that comes out of these talks, given that the president's here for about 40 minutes. I'm not sure they'll agree on all that much that they've not agreed on before. Well,
you've mentioned agreements or perhaps disagreements, because actually they're not quite seeing eye to eye on some key policy areas.
Yeah, absolutely, particularly in the context of this week, Ukraine. So President Biden is stopping off in the UK en route to that NATO meeting. Of course, the US and the UK agree on the fundamental strategy of supporting President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government as much as possible. But there are two areas where I think there are a couple of cracks when it comes to tactics. One is on those cluster bombs that President Biden signed off on going to Ukraine last week. President Biden says that was a difficult decision. It wasn't an easy one for him to make, but there is discomfort in number 10 about it. We know the Prime Minister doesn't agree. He said that he discourages the use of these munitions. It doesn't stop the red carpet being clean, no. Nevertheless. But the second thing that I think is really important here is what both sides are saying about Ukrainian membership of NATO. We all know that it's some way off. It's not going to happen imminently, but the UK has been talking over the weekend about Ukraine's rightful place being at the top table, being a full member of NATO. Well, President Biden, in an interview he did just before leaving for London, sort of said, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. It would be premature to talk about voting on Ukrainian membership in the future. There are still steps that they have to overcome, talking, for example, about democratic values. So in that sense, there's a bit of a difference as well. Does it change the fundamental strategy to the war in Ukraine? No, I don't think it does. But are there real differences when it comes to tactics? Yes, I think there are.
All right, Nick Eardley there at number 10, outside the big black door on Downing Street, waiting for President Biden to arrive. And we will certainly show you those pictures when the US president gets out of his vehicle and joins Rishi Sunak on the doorstep. And as we said, he's going off to see King Charles II. I suppose the question, Ed Vaizey, is there are quite key disagreements over cluster bombs that the Americans are now saying are justified in the war on Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine's NATO membership, and there have already been ripples over Northern Ireland. Does it matter?
No, I mean, I think allies disagree, friends disagree. I think it's a very needy question that we always ask ourselves. You know, does America really like us? Does this president really like us?
Well, do they?
America really likes us. We have a fantastic security partnership with America, defence partnership, intelligence sharing partnership. We obviously have massive trade with America, many cultural connections with America. We go on holiday in America, they come on holiday here. America really likes us. So we don't need to worry about it. We'll disagree on things. On cluster munitions, you know, the UK government has been leading the drive to eradicate cluster bombs. So, of course, it's incredibly embarrassing. It is a useful reminder to all of us in Britain that America will do its own thing when push comes to shove. It will pursue its own interests. It won't simply necessarily temper its policy to suit its British allies.
Do you agree? They really like us. Joe Biden really likes us. Does it matter that we could be falling out over some key issues?
Well, we are clearly, America is our closest ally, and there doesn't seem to me to be any threat to that. But what I would say about this is that we haven't been the most consistent ally to the Americans in recent years. If you look at the way that we've behaved over things like the Northern Ireland Protocol, we know that President Biden was very, very concerned about that.
And still is, I think.
I think he still is, and justifiably so, because we signed up to an agreement. We then said that we wanted to break that agreement very, very quickly afterwards. And so things like that have caused concern. I think that obviously in the sort of the long view is that there isn't any threat to that alliance, and that is something that the Labour Party is very, very clear that it wants to maintain. But we have to be consistent partners too if we want to maintain our diplomatic clout on the world stage.
Christina, does it matter, these differences?
Well, I think there are other differences as well between the approach of Biden and the approach of this government. And I say this, I was in the States earlier this year and I met some of the leaders from some of the main trade unions over there. And there is a huge difference in their social policy, I think, and certainly the way they treat working people and how they view them. And so President Biden has a very clear view that if you want to try and resolve the economic problems that you've got in the States, not only do you talk to employers, you also talk to trade unions, and that's something that's sadly missing in this country. So I think there are some very clear differences. In terms of this, I think there will always be differences in terms of the military policies. I agree, I think they are our closest ally. I think Europe is also a massive ally for us, and we haven't always got the balance right.
Are these normal disagreements? So it's quite interesting what Christina is saying, because a lot of commentary has said that actually Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak get on quite well, but they are different parties and they have different approach. Does it matter?
I don't think it necessarily matters on the domestic front, but I think also you asked the question, is Joe Biden a friend of Britain? And a lot of that sits within the kind of context of the noises off from Washington about Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland. And I think sometimes we make the mistake in the UK of thinking that only our politicians are playing politics, and that everybody else is sort of wholesome and righteous and is just saying the truth to power. Whereas actually they've got political games to play as well. And Joe Biden has a very sizable Irish-American constituency. And as most people who have spent any time in an Irish bar in the States with people who were born in the States and whose Irish connection is fairly limited will know, it matters to those people.
Right, politicians playing politics. Who would have thought it? Hey? Well, talking of which, let's move on to the economy and look at this headline in The Sun. Taxing times. Tory spat over tax cuts intensifies as Treasury Minister hits back at MPs demanding them now. You heard her in the headlines, Victoria Atkins, but also following on from what Jeremy Hunt has pretty well said, effectively said, ruling out big pre-election tax cuts this autumn. How damaging will that be internally for the Conservative Party, bearing in mind there is a significant, sizable wing who want tax cuts?
Well, it's a significant, sizable wing that's completely and utterly insane. I mean, it's just totally balmy, this complete obsession from a wing of the Conservative Party that you should cut taxes, and the idea also that it's going to help necessarily working people and make a material difference in their lives. What will help working people will be to reduce inflation, hopefully at some point see a topping out of interest rates and interest rates starting to fall. It's a complete misreading of history. I don't know why they're bang on about it. Margaret Thatcher raised taxes in her first term in order to stabilise the economy. Some people think that caused a lot of economic damage, but she did it, and
Yeah.
she only reduced taxes when she felt it was safe to do so. We've completely missed this enormous argument about tax simplification. We've got a fiendishly complicated tax structure, which we start taking. I mean, I could go on.
No, I was going to say, and you are going on a little bit, but let me just name a couple of the insane people in your party. James Duddridge, MP, who said pay restraint and tax cuts are needed to stimulate the economy whilst driving inflation down, which may be difficult to do. Jacob Rees-Mogg is another one. Are they mad?
James Duddridge is certainly not mad, and he's a great man, and I like him immensely, but I think he's wrong on this issue, and I think he should see the bigger picture, which I think Jeremy Hunt does see, which is that you have to look at the economy as a whole, you have to stabilise as far as you can the fundamentals, and to wish tax cuts to kind of fall from the air like manna from heaven is crazy.
Right. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg says people should be allowed to keep more of their money, particularly with the backdrop of an ongoing cost of living crisis.
Yes, but everyone, I mean, most people on the right who are Tories, like me, do agree with that sentiment, of course. If you can reduce taxes when it's safe to do so, you should do. You should start life thinking the state should not take money willy-nilly from people gratuitously, and you should allow and people are good at spending their own money. Of course, that's a philosophical position, but it's not the position we're in at the moment in terms of the state of this economy.
Would you agree it's an insane position to hold, Andy Sylvester, or have the Tories just given up the mantle of being a low-tax party, which they keep claiming to be?
I think that's probably the thing that galls the people I speak to in the city when they keep being told that there's a business-friendly government or a tax-cutting government, as no doubt we will hear tonight from Jeremy Hunt at Mansion House. It isn't necessarily the right time for swathes of tax cuts, right? If you genuinely are focused on inflation, which is largely out of the hands of political parties, by the way, it's largely a Bank of England as a monetary thing, more than a government thing.
Yeah.
But when you look forward and when you looked at these the Sunday rounds, watching them for 3 hours yesterday, as I do because I know how to have fun, it was status quo from both parties. And the status quo from both parties right now is, or after this government, is a 70-year high tax burden. It is economic growth that is lower than it needs to be in terms of trend growth, even going forward 2-3 years. And it faces up against a demographic challenge in this country and rising pressure on public services. And at some point, somebody is going to have to say, well, the status quo won't work to fund the state as it is today. And I fear that as we head into the election, and this is no great surprise, we'll hear very little of that sort of philosophical discussion, and we'll hear a lot of point scoring and don't worry, with the Labour Party we won't break everything this time, and the Tory Party saying, actually, I know it's looked like we've been in power for 13 years, but actually it was somebody else. We're not actually having the discussions we need to have or where Britain is going to be in 10, 15, 20 years' time in order to fund the state as people like to see it, and the sacrifices and trade-offs that are going to have to come as part of that with an ageing population.
Has he got a point, Jenny? Labour will just continue with the status quo. You're not offering, as we sit here today, anything different to what we're getting from the Conservatives.
The Labour Party is saying that it's the economy first because we are passionately committed to improving our public services. That is what the Labour Party is all about. But you cannot fund public services on passion and hope and determination. They are funded by money, and to get that, you need to run the economy in a stable and consistent way, which brings in the taxes that we can then spend on our public services. That is what the Labour Party is all about.
And so you're not going to raise taxes in the way Keir Starmer initially promised to do in order to pay more into those public services.
So the approach we're taking is that everything we want to spend, so we want to spend more money on, in the health service as an example, on more medical training places. We've been able to say that money comes from changes to the non-dom tax status that we would introduce. When we want to introduce changes in education, that money is going to come from changing the tax status of private education. So we're being very, very specific about it. The other thing we wouldn't do, Joe, is the tax cut, which, as far as I can see, is completely unfunded, which was brought in quite recently for people with pension pots of over £2 million. So there are some very clear and specific things that we would do differently. But you are quite right to point out, and I would like to emphasise, that Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor, is being absolutely clear that it is the economy first.
Christina, just before I come to you, just to remind viewers that, of course, we've got all eyes on Downing Street as well as this discussion on the economy. I mean, do you put your head in your hands listening to both parties, but perhaps particularly the Labour Party here, saying that they're not going to raise vast amounts of money if they win the next election to put into public services?
So I understand the Labour Party's reluctance to come out with a hard and fast policy that says they will tax whatever to fund public services. But as a public sector union, I actually believe we need a proper debate in this country about what people expect from their public services. So demand on things like the NHS, the fact that the care sector is, well, non-existent, even though Boris Johnson promised he had some kind of oven-ready deal for it. The fact that we've got an education system where that funding has dried up, basically. All of that has to be dealt with, but it has to be funded. And there needs to be a proper grown-up debate.
And how would you fund it?
I would fund it through taxation,
right.
Absolutely. And I think trying to just bring in, and I don't mean just taxation as in PAYE, as in those who are earning. I mean actually looking at how we tax wealth in this country, not just pay. I represent almost 1.3 million members, all of whom pay their taxes through PAYE. None of them have all kinds of schemes which mean they don't pay their taxes. They pay their taxes.
Well, it's very clear what Christina says.
I don't
where
disagree.
is that honest debate?
I don't disagree. I mean, I agree. No, I use double negatives, classic politician thing. But, I agree with everything that Christina's just said. And I think that the Labour Party is interested in having that wider debate.
And higher taxes.
Well, we are interested in having that wider debate about public services, how they're funded, what it is that we ought to be paying for, how you get the health service more into people's homes, into the community, which is what people say they want, how we invest more in prevention. Those are the debates that we are really excited to be having. But you cannot go into government as a new government without being clear with voters about what you're going to spend, where you're going to spend it first, and where that money is going to come from. And that is just about being honest and transparent with the people that we're asking to be in charge of their mortgages, of their kids' futures, of their education. We're asking a lot.
But are we talking about a bigger health service? Are we talking about a bigger state, if you think that's what people would like, and maybe that means higher taxes or not?
No, I agree with Andy. I think this whole debate has gone down a completely pointless cul-de-sac. You're not going to... We've got to the stage, I think, with the health service where more money is not going to move the dial in the way perhaps it did when Labour came in 1997.
And Jenny, you agree with that?
We already spend at a very high level compared to our European countries. If I could just develop the point,
Go on then.
which is that we are going to have a fundamental look at how we reform our public services to be as effective as possible. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, based on what Christine was saying earlier, that you shouldn't look at new taxes as well. I mean, even as a Tory, it offends me that somebody can purchase a property for 80 million quid and pay the same council tax as somebody living in a property of, £1 million, which is still a very expensive property. So it strikes me as you've got all this property that doesn't move, you can tax it, and we have no sophisticated plan to have interesting and sophisticated taxes on property.
I mean, all I would say to that is that the Labour Party... I've just spent the whole weekend celebrating 75 years of the NHS in Tredegar, where Nye Bevan created the NHS. And my reflection on this is that when Labour came to power in 1997, there were people waiting well over a year and a half for heart treatment. We stopped that from happening.
But you did follow Conservative rules, Bridget, for 2 years.
We did. And we still managed to make those improvements in the health service. And I'll tell you why that is.
Taxes were put up too.
Because we valued the health service, we respected the workers in the health service, and we made a plan that, yes, it was backed by investment, but the crucial thing about that plan was that it was shared between the government and the people working in the service and the trade unions and the leaders.
Yeah, but you've also got to remember that the Labour...
So if I can just finish my point. So that plan was owned, not by the Labour Party, it was owned by the people from top to bottom working in the NHS, and that's why it was successful. Tony
Blair, who remains quite a dominant political voice, he introduced independent treatment centres under the last Labour government. As a constituency MP, I saw the massive impact they had on waiting lists. They were closed down effectively by union opposition. Blair has talked now, I don't believe, by the way, in co-payment, but he has talked about more private sector involvement in the NHS. That is a difficult issue to grasp when we treat the NHS as this religion, but it is exactly the kind of debate we should be having.
Hang on,
I'm
Christina's
glad that
shaking her head.
Ed thinks we have that kind of power. There are so many things.
We're coming on to that in a minute.
Sector that I would wish we could close down through that. I think that's unfair to say and untrue to say that there was the trade union opposition. There were things about independent treatment centres that we didn't like. There was a fact about when you hand over bits of the NHS to companies that make profits from it, then obviously you're taking money out of the NHS. We have a fundamental opposition to that, as I think many people in this country do.
All right.
And I wouldn't like to see that replicated in other parts of our public services.
You can just see here the motorcade coming into Downing Street, and shortly we will no doubt see President Biden get out of one of those many cars and walk up Downing Street, hopefully to be greeted. Oh, look, the pictures have frozen. Timing is everything, isn't it? He will appear on that red carpet, greeted by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. As we discussed at the beginning of the programme, it is a fleeting visit en route to that NATO summit, but there'll be plenty to talk about, and they don't agree on all of it, particularly things like Ukraine membership or joining NATO. Also, this issue of cluster bombs, which are extremely controversial, but which President Joe Biden thinks is justified in terms of the war in Ukraine. And there has been a debate over the replacement to NATO Secretary-General. It is thought that Joe Biden perhaps blocked the idea of Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, becoming the next Secretary-General. In fact, no one can agree, and so that has been put on hold just for the moment. We'll keep those pictures running. Andy, just going back to our discussion, when you talk about the decisions that have to be made in terms of public services and how they're funding and taxation, what would you like to see?
I mean, a genuine significant reform of the NHS in which we stop screaming about the system that Joe Biden's country has and we actually start looking at European alternatives which are cheaper, more effective, keep people alive more, are more sustainable in the long term. But I guess my concern on the tax and spend thing, two very quick points. One, it's not like we're in stasis when it comes to tax plans, right? Because of fiscal drag, wages going up, the tax threshold's not moving. Actually, this is a tax hiking government when it comes to income tax, and that will probably remain the same under a Keir Starmer government. The second point is it's a bit of a ratchet, isn't it? As I say, we're at a 70-year tax burden. Everything becomes more expensive. It's never the right time to do tax cuts. And I think we've got to a philosophical point in Westminster, and this isn't picking on Jenny, but you said tax cuts are unfunded. Well, actually, no, public services could be unfunded. Tax cuts are not unfunded because tax cuts are how you fund public services, and I think we need to make sure that A leads to B rather than B, you know, being governed by A. There's a tail dog wagging thing here.
When you cut a tax,
Very clear exposition of economics here.
But the trouble is, when you cut a tax, that does cost you money, right? So
Well, no,
unless you can say
it doesn't cost you money.
It
means you have to stop funding public services.
But let's just go back to that core question, because you said it's treated like a religion. Andy's talking about changing the funding formula, or at least having a debate about it, or looking at a European-style model. Is it time for that now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've got to stop
social
having this, you know, I don't agree with Christine about the private sector. I don't think it's wrong to have private sector providers working within the NHS. For me, the sacrosanct principle is that you should get medical care free at the point of use, regardless of your income. That is very important. How that is provided for me is I'm completely agnostic about, and our refusal to countenance different models of healthcare seems crazy. I don't particularly want to go down a co-payment route, by the way.
Right.
I think that's probably highly bureaucratic, probably wouldn't raise any money, and probably could have some adverse outcomes. But why we can't start talking about independent treatment centres, particularly for routine operations, which can be clear, where the backlog could be massively impacted, I don't know.
Well, that's already happening.
Exactly.
I mean,
it's been happening for years.
This isn't new. We've had the private sector coming in, dealing with waiting lists all over the country. That's been happening for years.
And do we need more of it?
Not necessarily. There's always been an issue. There's always been a place for the private sector in the NHS, as there is in most public services. The problem I have with it, and I think many people have, is, and you just have to look at what's happened in water to see this. Once you start bringing in a profit element into something which is an essential public service. All you're doing is taking money out of that to pay shareholders rather than deal with patients.
There's the handshake, the obligatory handshake, sincerely felt, I'm sure, outside number 10 with the US President Joe Biden there with Rishi Sunak. As we said earlier, they've met plenty of times, more than I can remember any Prime Minister meeting a US President in such short succession. They've gone in, they have only got about 45 minutes together, but he's here and he's inside number 10, and then he will be going off eventually to the NATO summit. Just briefly, let's talk about pay and the unions. This headline here, Christina, Minister refuses to commit to following pay board advice. This again was Victoria Atkins saying, as usual, government ministers usually say, no, we do follow pay board advice.
There is an irony
but
there,
not on this occasion, because it's been put at 6.5% higher than actually the recommendation from the government. What do you make of that?
So it's just, I can't believe the irony out of that. Actually, I can believe it. We spent most of last year, from the summer, from July up until about February, March this year, arguing with the government to say, you need to talk to us about pay. We're in dispute. You must sit down and talk to us about it. And all we constantly got back was, no, there's an independent peer review bodies process. We're sticking to that. We don't want to talk to you. That was blown out of the water at some point, and I'm glad to say that happened. And then they sat down and talked to us, and we found a resolution to the pay dispute that certainly my members were involved in. You know, we're the biggest union in the NHS. We don't have doctors and dentists, but basically we represent all the other categories of staff. And eventually they did sit down and talk to us about it, and we did find a way through. But so it's really quite interesting that now they're jumping behind it to say, well, wait a minute, we only want to follow them when they're doing what we want them to do. If they actually start and become independent and come out with something that the government hasn't asked them to do, we're not going to follow it. So it has blown the whole thing about them being independent. We've known for years they're not truly independent, and to be quite honest, we would be quite happy to move to a system where we negotiate with the government and with NHS and with employers in public services.
If not now, when, in terms of honouring the pay review body?
Yeah, well, I don't know what insight the government ministers have, because I'm not a government minister on what their position is on the pay review body. But I think Christine makes a pretty effective point, and the fact that she can make that point, I think, shows how vulnerable the government is on this issue. You can't, to coin a phrase, have your cake and eat it. You can't spend your time saying this is not a matter for government, it's a matter for the independent pay review body, and then when the independent pay review body is considering it, be asked, will you accept it, and say, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. The get-out clause that a government minister can use is everything has to, all pay awards have to fall within the realms of affordability, and it may be that
we'll come to
a pay review body...
Would Labour, would you honour that 6.5% for teachers?
We just wouldn't have got into this situation.
I know, Jenny, but the thing is, this is the situation, and I know that you and other Labour members, of course, want to say we wouldn't be here.
I mean, we've said consistently that we think the government should honour the pay review body's
so you would at 6.5%.
But it is just bizarre that this government has allowed things to degenerate to the extent that they have. And we've never, you know, when Labour was in power, we never had health workers on strike. It just didn't happen because we knew how to speak to people. We knew how to negotiate. We knew how to involve people. I'm not saying we did, you know, there were arguments, don't get me wrong, big ones.
So you are on, you are
not where we should have
You're
landed.
promising to honour this 6.5%.
Why is it that the government has time to negotiate and faff around with peerages for Boris Johnson's friends, and it doesn't have time to sit down with doctors and nurses and teachers, get around the table and get these things sorted out?
Because the government says they're not affordable. Are they affordable, these pay rises?
I'm not going to go into the weeds of this particular issue because it isn't my issue. What I will say is it points to a wider problem in the fact that any time there's any kind of spending restraint in the United Kingdom now, it's treated as sort of parsimonious government austerity 2.0. Yeah, our public debt is now bigger than the entire size of our economy. At some point, we're going to have to start addressing the size of our debt pile and the fact that we're borrowing huge amounts of money. We've established that there isn't a huge plan to grow the economy particularly. So at some point, we are going to have, again, the discussion we maybe had in the run-up to the 2010 election about the size of the state, and maybe we're just in one of those cycles. But on this issue, and other people around this table know a hell of a lot more than me about it, But if every time a government minister says, well, hold on, maybe not that much, we have some sort of almighty row that it's the end of time and space, then we are going to be just constantly ratcheting up both the size of the state and therefore, I'm afraid, the amount of borrowing or taxation to pay for it.
Doesn't that diminish the significance and impact of going on strike then?
I don't think. I mean, if we have to go on strike to get governments and employers to talk to us, that's what we have to do. We don't particularly want to go on strike.
Yeah. It's not working, though, is it? They're not talking to you. I mean, some of the
that's all I can tell you.
But it isn't working. I mean, you've said in a speech last month that the recent wave of strike action has changed history. What's changed?
Well, I think the fact that people thought unions were dead and that weren't going anywhere. And I think we've shown that actually, no, unions were being sensible. Unions were trying to engage with employers and governments for many years. When you come up against a brick wall and people just won't talk to you, when we've seen the cost of living crisis, which has totally and utterly devastated so many people in this country, and still government won't sit down and talk to us about it. And if you look at the history of this, so you talked about going into the run-up to the 2010 election. So following the 2010 election, we had years of austerity. We were all told this would solve the economic problems of the country. It didn't. All that happened was you kept down pay, certainly for public sector workers, but actually I think across the board, which meant people had less spending power, which meant that you couldn't actually invigorate the economy in certain local areas. And we know from studies that we've done that public sector workers spend between 60 and 70% of their pay in their local economy. If you continually cut their pay, they don't have money to spend, and that has an impact on local
at the moment,
businesses.
with inflation rising, that might be something that the government doesn't necessarily want to see. But it is true. I mean, Christina says that unions aren't dead. Clearly, they're not. But we've seen unprecedented strike action. I mean, the first ever nurses' strike, I think, as Jenny was saying, the first senior doctors' strike and consultants. I mean, these are people that have never, ever been on strike. What does that say about a Conservative government's inability to resolve these issues?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to defend the government on that point. I mean, I should be more Andy and just say, look, this is not my issue.
No, but you are a Conservative. You're a Conservative peer. He is the editor of
the point is, look, on the one hand, yes, of course, I would not, you know, it's unfortunate the government seems to have got itself into a position where people, particularly nurses, for example, who we never think of as people who would withdraw their labour, are doing that. But at the same time, I don't support the strikes, and I think they hurt the very people that the unions are there to protect. They hurt working people who need to get to work. They hurt working people who need medical care to improve the quality of their life. And I don't think they've achieved anything. I don't think they've changed history. I don't think they've achieved anything in terms of what the unions want to achieve in terms of pay rises or better conditions. So I think the strikes are very aggravating. I think some of them are highly political, like the tube workers' strike, and I don't support them.
Let's look at this headline in The Observer. We need more EU workers, admits leading Tory Brexiteer. George Eustice, the former Environment Secretary, is calling for a reciprocal visa scheme so that under-35s can work across the EU and Britain. He says the current labour shortages are caused by the failure of a post-Brexit immigration policy. Is he right, Ed?
Well, welcome again. We're back with the insane wing of the Conservative Party. You know, they promised us this Brexit was going to be absolute nirvana. During the campaign, we would stay members of the single market, but we had to stop free movement. Guess what? We need people from the EU to come and work here, particularly in some particular seasonal industries. Guess what? Lots of Brits would like to work in the EU and perhaps even retire in the EU. Guess what? George Eustice has just effectively proposed free movement of people, but with bureaucratic knobs on. I mean, we are going back to the future, and it's so frustrating.
Well, would you like to say that? Would you agree with him? Let's have this scheme for under-35s to come here from the EU for 2 years. Is that a good idea?
I would like the government to get a grip on immigration. That's all I want.
Well,
I want
people. What does that mean?
Well,
do you want more immigration, more of this type of immigration, low-skilled, high-skilled?
What people voted for, I think, when they were voting for Brexit in terms of immigration, was control over the system.
Yeah.
That's what they want. That is something that could be provided, we could achieve.
But we have got that. We have got that.
I'm not seeing it.
Well, we've got a points-based system. They can decide the government who comes here. What George Eustice is saying, they've got the wrong people coming.
What I am seeing is massive backlogs, people not getting.
Hang on, that's asylum. You're talking about asylum cases. Let's talk about immigration in terms of
600,000 new visas being issued, more visas than ever being issued because we've failed to tackle the skills crisis in this country.
So which shortage occupations would you take off the list?
We've had nurses on the shortage occupation list for 15 years because the government has failed to grip a crisis in training of our health workforce. So you cannot separate your skills need, your industrial need and your education system from your immigration system. This government has attempted to ignore any sort of skills strategy for years. Now it's panicking over the fact it's got to recruit health workers from overseas. The first thing you've got to do, if we need health workers and care workers in this country, then we need to have them, because we've got to run the system safely for patients and for people already working here. But you have to invest in training and skills.
All right, we'll come on to
retaining
training and
that
skills, but I
workforce.
still don't know which areas you would take off the shortage occupation
But
list.
you don't just take them off, do you?
Right.
You don't just
well,
take, like there's crazy Tories that Ed's talking about want to just take them off the list without any plan whatsoever of how you replace them.
and would you support
That's
this new scheme that
ridiculous.
George Eustace is talking about,
Well,
having a
George
reciprocal
Eustace-
visa scheme?
George
Well, never mind, but
Eustace-
do you think it's a good idea?
George Eustace is having a laugh. George Eustace is the guy who spent years saying we had, you know, our seasonal agricultural workers policy, which he was in charge of. Absolute failure. Now he's trying to dip his oar into these other type of workers. I mean, some of these people need to have a little bit of self-reflection and you know, allow people who've got a long-term plan for the future of the country to take some of these decisions.
Does he have a point that actually we need more low-skilled immigration rather than the skilled workers coming into areas and occupations in which there are no shortages?
I mean, my view remains open the doors and build some houses, and we solve most of our economic problems. But there are some fairly serious shortages around low-skilled worker. Of course, there is a question about whether we should call care home workers, as we sort of vaguely are in the topic we're talking about, skilled workers, because I wouldn't want to do it. I don't know if I could. I might not be skilled physically, but mentally it's really quite draining. I think somewhere in between there's an argument that this is about control. It is about thinking about what our immigration policy looks like. I personally think that's a brilliant idea. My only fear is that with housing costs as they are and various other issues in the United Kingdom and average pay not really moving anywhere, I'm not sure it's a great idea to tell all of our under 35s they can go and live in Barcelona for a couple of years. So we might have more of a skill shortage than we started with. We do have to separate immigration and asylum, of course we do. In the city, talking to especially the tech sector, everyone knows this, there is actually a welcome appreciation of the fact that post-Brexit, the way the tech visa system has worked is actually, it's been pretty good. I think there were an awful lot of people who were worried that that was going to be a nightmare, and it's actually worked quite well to bring in the best and brightest. Now, if we could take the success that we've had there and move it into other sectors or across the economy, that would be awesome, and then we would have a functioning immigration system I think we could all get on board with and tweak around the edges. I don't think we're having that debate in large part because you look at that Guardian headline, it said, admits former Brexiteer minister. It's like, it's been 7 years, can we all move on? Can we start having a conversation about the future?
Right. Well, is it a good idea just having the reciprocal scheme?
I don't see any problem with it. I have to say I agree with what you just said there, which is open the doors and build more houses. Those are two things we absolutely have to do in this country. I think there should be freedom of movement. I think...
Would you like to see Labour back it at the next election?
I would. It's something I think would work. And I think what I hate is the rhetoric that we've now developed into. And you're right, you have to separate what's happening with refugees and with migrants, immigrant workers. But that's not what's happening. And what we get is that, I have to say, incredibly negative, aggressive rhetoric coming from the current government. The language they use when they talk about people, this whole idea of trying to paint people as other, that they're different from us, they don't share our values, they don't understand our culture, it is incredibly damaging to this country. And when you look at things like some of the sectors that absolutely rely on migrant workers, like the care sector, like the NHS, they would fall down if we didn't have that freedom of movement. And the mad idea we got, was it just last week or the week before, from some of these conservative...
what, to take the care workers? Well, we'll come to that.
Mad conservative group about saying, take visas off care workers. You have to think that these 20 people sit in a room and think, what would be a good idea? I know, let's take visas off care workers. And not one of them thought, wait a minute, maybe that's not such a good idea. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Well, and that's because, of course, they would argue that people wanted to see less immigration. I mean, Christina would like to see the return of freedom of movement, Jenny. Keir Starmer once believed in freedom of movement. Should it be considered again?
Look, I just think that what people were voting for and what they were told they were going to get was control. And that means not having freedom of movement. Now, that doesn't mean to say you have no movement. It doesn't mean to say you have the system as chaotic as it is now. And I think that it's easy to say we want to separate issues of immigration from worker visas. Of course, that's correct intellectually, but what happens, I'm telling you now, if you're sitting watching people arriving, no control, 1% of applications dealt with over a 12-month period, people in hotels in your community, then whether we like it or not, that makes people very, very suspicious of the whole immigration system.
Unless
and I think
politicians aren't articulating the arguments properly.
Politicians can articulate what they like, but if people see things in their own community, they lose faith in what those politicians are saying to them. And you have got to deal with it's anti-humanitarian, it's cruel, it's costing people's lives, and so there's lots of good reasons to deal with this, as well as people's attitudes. That's probably the last important reason. But you have to deal with it. And we kid ourselves if we think all we need to do is just sit here and explain things a little bit more clearly or deal with the press. People see things in their own community. They reach their own decisions.
You've made, but as you say, these things are important in terms of the needs from an economic point of view to this country.
Yes,
and George Eustace, yes, you can mock him because of what he said during the arguments over leaving the EU. But is he right now that we need to open up again, perhaps to EU workers? I was going to get Ed to respond.
Well, yes, I think we do. I mean, I do think, I absolutely accept what Jenny says, and I'm obviously, find it very difficult to move on from Brexit, and I come on programmes like this.
But maybe you should,
really
as Andy
for
said.
some free therapy. But, Andy's been good for me as part of this session to kind of encourage me to move on. But the point I'm making is that any kind of developed economy, particularly an ageing economy like ours, does rely to a certain extent on immigration to fill some of the jobs that people here don't want to do, but also the kind of jobs that need the skills that we want. Now, I'm not saying we are not going to rejoin the EU and we're not going to have free movement, but we should at least recognise that in many instances, immigration, and I totally accept we should have control on immigration. Every country does. But immigration is a good thing for economies and countries like ours. It's also good culturally, in my view.
So I agree with Ed on that. One thing I would say is that if you're going to have a shortage occupations list, one, it allows you to bring people in to the country to do those jobs, and we would all, I think, agree with that. But what you need to do is, if it's a shortage occupation, deal with why it's a shortage occupation. So deal with the number of people going into those occupations, the training and the skills and all the issues you need around that, so that these jobs don't stay on the shortage occupation list indefinitely, which is what we've got now.
All right. Before we move on, a reminder, you can now catch up with Politics Live all day long on BBC Sounds every day. We're publishing each programme as a podcast. Very handy if you're on the move. Better still, of course, is to watch it live. Just before we go, just to show you this, Jenny, to start with. Oh, well, you're laughing at least.
I am laughing.
The Sunday Times. I hate tree huggers.
Yes.
Keir Starmer explodes over green policy. What's this about?
Well, I was in that meeting.
Oh.
And,
Good.
And that is not how I interpreted it at all. I couldn't believe it when I read that.
But did he say that?
So what he was saying was, he was talking about our net zero strategy and our green investment in energy. And what he's saying is, look, there are some really good reasons to do this around achieving net zero and decarbonisation. But his main motive for doing this is about investment in skills and jobs and the future of our economy, because the whole world is moving in this direction. We've got to get ahead of it. So he's saying that he...
Did he say, I hate tree huggers?
No, he didn't say, I hate tree huggers.
Have you made him a badge with I hate tree huggers on it?
Because
I'll tell you, he's won more votes with that phrase than he has in the last 6 months.
What's he going to do when he meets the king?
He's met the king, they get on quite well.
Because Joe Biden was saying, I love tree huggers.
He's talking about the importance of our green industrial strategy being about jobs and the economy, as well as just...
He definitely said it, though.
So what did he say that led to that headline?
He was, well, because he was saying his motive isn't about hugging trees, and I think he talked about sandal wearing as well.
This story is getting out of control.
It is about making sure that our regions, like the North East, where I live, which has big oil and gas sector, big chemical industries, steel-making heritage, that they have the jobs of the future in those places. It's about the economy.
Jenny, can I just ask also, was tofu mentioned at any point?
You know, tofu didn't come into it, but I will go back to him on that issue.
Well, there you go. On that
that
exclusive revealed by Jenny Chapman, that not only is he not very keen on tree huggers, but also people who wear sandals. Thank you very much to all of our guests for joining me today, and a lighter moment to end the programme. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 11:45. Still a bit earlier, but 11:45. Put it in your diary. See you. Bye. you.